Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar organised by the Centre for English Identity and Politics at Southampton University. Turns out to be quite a timely event. Yesterday's announcement and discussion about levelling up, whatever you thought about who actually got the money or the criteria, couldn't have done more to emphasise the extent to which, even when we come to trying to close economic and social inequalities, it's a matter of local authorities going cap in hand as supplicants to central government, which then decides who gets money and how much and what for. But this isn't a recent problem. Labour's manifesto before 1997 suggested that there was going to be a great deal more devolution than actually took place. And it sometimes seems to me that every opposition leader has a speech that they give, usually to a gathering of their own councillors or perhaps to the local government association, that announces that they're going to be the first Prime Minister to give away power rather than to hoard it at the centre. So what we're trying to do today is to understand why that happens. One possible explanation is simply the perfidious nature of politicians who make all sorts of promises that they don't intend to keep. But we want to go rather more deeply into this today and ask some more profound questions. Is the way in which the centre of the government of the United Kingdom, which is also the government of England, is the way the centre organised, the way it works, the way it thinks, proving a fundamental obstacle to the sort of devolution that so many people think that England wants? We've got a fantastic panel today to discuss this. All of them are people who are hugely respected academics who've written in, on and around this subject over recent years and studied it closely. But also all of them have in different ways been very close to how government actually works, working with government at national level and at local level to help shape and advise on policy. So it's a great panel that we've got today. Just to introduce them briefly, and then I'll ask them to speak in turn. Professor Patrick Diamond is at Queen Mary University of London. Professor Diana Coyle is the Bennett Professor of Public Policy at Cambridge University. Professor Janice Morphet is from the Bartlett School of Planning at UCL, and Arianna Giovannini is Assistant Professor at de Montfort University. I won't go into their long CVs. You can look them up if you like, that their experience will become immediately apparent. Each of our speakers is going to speak for about 8 minutes initially. I would encourage anybody who's on the call who'd like a question put to the panel to put it in the Q&A section. And please, of course, do use the chat function to discuss amongst yourselves as the webinar proceeds. And at the end, I will try to bring in as many of the questions that you've posed as possible. But to start things off and to give his initial thoughts, Patrick Diamond. Patrick.
Well, thanks very much, John, and it's great to be with you, and thanks for inviting me to contribute to this really important seminar. I think the subject matter has always been important, but it's become more so in the light of recent events, not least the government's announcements yesterday on the Shared Prosperity Fund, but I think also some of the reports that were published before Christmas, not least the Brown Commission looking at the potential future of constitutional reform and also devolution. So it's good to be able to share thoughts with the panel and the audience this afternoon. So I'll try to be brief, just to say that I've been asked to talk about English devolution and problems at the centre of government. And of course, one ambiguity, as you pointed out in your introduction, is are we talking about the centre of UK government or the centre of English government? And that's something that we might can come back to during the discussion. But the key argument which I want to make at the outset is that for English devolution to work effectively and to be productive, then there has to be a capable centre of government. Devolution inevitably involves dialogue and negotiation between the centre and local institutions, whether they're elected mayors, whether they're combined authorities, local councils. In summary, local actors need a centre of government which they can do business with. In the absence of that, it's very difficult for devolution to really function effectively. The other point that I would just make an introduction is also a paradox, in a sense, the paradox of government at the centre in England, which is that, as I think many people would agree, England has among the most centralised governments in the advanced economies, and yet in many respects, the centre of government is brittle and ineffective and lacks important capacity. So we have a centre that is nominally very powerful, but actually in key respects is ineffective and lacks the tools to do things effectively. So let's just move on then and discuss briefly what some of these problems at the centre of government are. And I think some of these problems are much discussed, long debated, and very well known. I think among the most important is the tendency of the centre of government in the UK and England to be exposed to a very strong degree of policy churn and policy instability, which of course manifests itself also in institutional instability. I mean, there are many examples of this. I think perhaps one of the most important in the area of governance relates to the changes that were made after the 2010 election. The Labour governments previously had put in place an architecture around devolution, which included the creation of regional development agencies after 1997. And of course, RDAs were abolished after 2010 and replaced by LEPs as the successor governance institution in regional economic policy. So we know that when general elections happen and the party of government changes, that tends to lead to policy churn. But of course, we also see this happening within government. So within the Conservative government that's been in power in one form or another since 2010, there's also been a strong degree of policy churn in this area. One example would be around industrial strategy. The May government in 2016 attempted to put in place a more ambitious industrial strategy, which has then been in different ways weakened and in some respects abandoned by her successors. So, Whitehall suffers from a high degree of policy churn. I think this is in part a reflection of hyper-politicisation, something we might come back to talk about later, a lack of long-term consensus between political parties, which adds to this somewhat febrile atmosphere of institutional instability. I think a second problem with the centre relates to siloisation. Again, those who are familiar with how Whitehall operates will be aware that Whitehall is structured around a series of functionally demarcated departments with defined responsibilities, and this strongly undermines cross-government coordination. I think also from the perspective of devolution, it means that local actors and organisations are having to make sense of an array of initiatives from Whitehall departments that often don't seem coherent. And of course, one aspect of this is the emergence of a bid culture in which local councils in particular are spending enormous amounts of time having to write funding bids, responding to different parts of the centre against a series of initiatives that just don't really appear to add up. I think a third problem which I wanted to mention is around the centre's tendency to micromanage the delivery of public services. And over the last 30 years, this is something which has increased in significance. We know that the centre of government has tended to intervene more and more in service delivery, whether this involves more use of inspections, greater use of targets, more reliance on performance management, alongside sanctions for failing providers and so-called failing institutions. Yet the evidence does not suggest that centralised micromanagement improves long-term performance in public services, not least because often the centre of government has a relatively weak understanding of implementation. This brings me to my fourth point, which is another problem relating to infrastructure and policy implementation itself. Whitehall has never had a strong track record in managing major projects relating to infrastructure. And the Whitehall culture has also been one in which policy making has tended to be regarded as more important and prestigious than policy implementation itself. The understanding of delivery in the centre of government, with some exceptions, remains weak. And although there have been various attempts to try to shift the emphasis back onto delivery, in many respects, there's still a very long way to go. So I think these problems that I've talked about, in particular issues around policy churn and siloisation, are very well known, long established, and have been under discussion for, in some respects, many decades, going back to the 1960s. But there are also some more recent problems. I just want to very quickly mention two. I think one is that the centre of government lacks effective mechanisms for managing centre-local relations and also for overseeing intergovernmental relationships. We know that local councils are often relying on ad hoc personal relationships and contacts in order to establish a relationship with ministers and civil servants at the centre. And it's just not an adequate basis for devolution to function if councils are having to rely on these kinds of personal contacts, themselves often dependent on party politics. There's no statutory requirement on the centre of government to either consult or meet regularly with local authorities on most policy issues. And of course, we know that in England, as across the UK, local councils have no formal constitutional status. This is something, of course, which the Brown Commission attempts to address. A final problem which I would just mention quickly, which I think again has become more evident in perhaps the recent or last decade or so, is the lack of capacity at the centre. Over the last decade or so, of course, civil service numbers in Whitehall have fallen. And although they've begun to rise again in some departments, there are many parts of government that still appear to be underpowered. This is not just, of course, about numbers of civil servants employed, it's about capacity. It's about the loss of experienced staff. It's about struggles around equipping people with the right skill sets. It's about attracting talent into Whitehall. And I would just add to that I think the centre's capabilities have also been undermined by growing conflicts between ministers and civil servants and the kind of long-term breakdown of the public service bargain between officials and ministers, which is so important to functional governance at the centre. Obviously, there's a lot more to be said about that, but I think the recent departure of some permanent secretaries is an illustration of how that relationship has become much more conflictual, at least in the senior civil service. So in summary, John, and I'll finish here, I would say the centre's problem overall is its tendency towards overreach. It tries to do too much without having effective levers and tools. And I think this was underlined by yesterday's Shared Prosperity Fund announcements, in which we see the centre trying to determine and decide local priorities that should be the responsibility of local institutions. That's, I think, a classic example of trying to do too much, but lacking effective tools to deliver. And I would argue that to solve complex policy problems, whether it's regional economic underperformance, long-term social disadvantage, achieving the challenging targets around net zero, this requires the centre of government and sub-regional and local tiers of governance to work together much more effectively. I think local councils and local actors have an incentive to try to make the centre of government in England more effective. I have some ideas for how we might begin to do that. Let me perhaps bring those in later in the discussion and hand over now to the other contributors. So I'll leave it there.
Patrick, thank you very much. And that's a great start and a long list of issues to deal with. And I'll certainly make sure that we come back in the questions and the discussions to the practical means of reform that we can address. Just to remind people on the call, do put in questions or use the chat if you'd like to do that. But I'm going to move swiftly on to our next speaker, Diana Coyle. Diane.
Thank you so much. Well, Patrick's got us off to a great start with that overview of what the various issues are. My own experience has been partly sitting on various national advisory bodies. I'm an economist, so they have mainly been in economic policy domains, but also long engagement with Greater Manchester. It's my home city. Helped put together the Manchester Independent Economic Review in 2009 that paved the way for the first of the city deals, and have stayed involved doing the Independent Prosperity Review and observing that process as it's unfolded over the years. And it's very hard to judge how successful or not it's been without knowing what the counterfactual would be. And of course, there have been headwinds of the aftermath of the financial crisis and the pandemic. But I think there have been some successes, but in other ways, it's been disappointing. The city is still punching below its weight in any international comparison of second-tier cities. So every bit of devolving power within England, and to take Patrick's first point, I'm talking about English devolution and the UK central government and Whitehall and Westminster. It'll be interesting to get on to discussion about the nations too. But every bit of the devolution within England has been reluctant. There's been inadequate amounts of money, and it's been compromised. And these small dribbles of competitive bidding just make strategic decisions and investments much, much harder to make around the country. Now, you would think in principle that in some ways, strategic decision-making, long-term decision-making would be more possible at a more local level for a number of reasons. One key reason is having the information that's needed. And there is a granularity of information that you don't get sitting in a central department with official statistics. No matter, even if that department is part of it is moved to Darlington, you're still thinking about Cornwall from one central location. And there's a lot of information that isn't captured in statistics that comes from people talking to each other in the kinds of networks that exist locally. So information, I think, is an important part of the economic case for devolution. Another point is about aligning the different actors, because if you're thinking about strategy as such as industrial strategy, you need to get a number of public sector agencies, the private sector, the third sector, all aligned in different ways, exchanging the information that's needed. And that kind of coordination across networks is, again, more straightforward at a more local level. I don't think there's a lot of science about the right level for different kinds of decisions to be made, but I think it's clear that doing all of that centrally is much less effective. And again, as Patrick touched on, the accountability structures for that are tricky because we have this messy patchwork of overlapping layers of different responsibilities around England, with combined authorities and LEPs and so on, whose boundaries don't match up and whose responsibilities sometimes are in tension with each other. But I think strategic thought, strategic investments are more possible locally. They would be possible nationally, but they don't happen nationally. There's constant policy churn. The Institute for Government some years ago did a fantastic piece of work on further education policy post-16 and counted the number of major policy shifts in I think it was a 20-year period. Recently with a colleague, we looked at industrial strategies or policies, and since 1980, since Mrs. Thatcher abolished NEDI in the early 80s, there have been at least a dozen major economic strategy or industrial strategy announcements. That's not a strategy, that's a complete misnomer. And when governments are asking private sector companies and individuals to make long-term investment decisions, and in fact for individuals with their education and skills, some of that decision will last with them for the rest of their lifetime. For government to be chopping and changing in a major way every few years is actually a real abrogation of responsibility at the centre. I think it's absolutely shocking. So we know that churn happens. It happens across different domains, happens with industrial strategies. It isn't clear why Mrs. May's industrial strategy of 2017 got torn up by the successor government from her own party. But we also looked at all of the economic policy, all of the policy documents published by the Boris Johnson administration during a 12-month period. And during 12 months, which were launched with a new economic strategy, Plan for Growth, we looked at simply how much did the different documents refer to each other? How much joining up was there across major policy documents? And the answer shocked me. It's almost none. And we have some nice diagrams, heat maps, that show you the extent to which different concepts or policies are repeated in successive documents, and the terms used and the ideas used in the initial strategy document just aren't picked up in the successors during the next 12 months. So this degree of dysfunction at the centre seems to me to be increasing and not decreasing. And I think it's something worth discussing when we come to that. Why has the centre become so incapable of any kind of long-term thinking? Is it to do with a toxic combination of first past the post and centralisation itself? Is it feeding on itself? I don't know what the answer to that is. But I would like to see some serious reflection by politicians in Westminster and by leaders in Whitehall as to why this has come about. I think it's a really big issue. But these current structures simply make long-run economic decisions around the country impossible. And this is particularly true of education and skills, where people set out their whole lifetime earnings and career paths with the decisions that they take at young ages, given our structure. and also for parts of infrastructure. Some parts of infrastructure decision-making need to be national, but other parts are definitely subnational, better made subnationally. And I think we ought to have some serious reflection about that. And as a final thought, or two final thoughts actually, first, we don't have any evaluation of policy to speak of. It's a real gap. Patrick referred to the way that there's much more interest in the centre in policy analysis than in implementation. There's also much more interest in the initial analysis than there is in the evaluation. Now, of course, if you're changing things every 12 months, there's nothing to evaluate. There won't have been time for anything to have an impact. So that combination of leaving something in place for long enough for it to have an effect and then doing a proper evaluation of it afterwards is something that we're shockingly lacking in our system. There's no way for the whole system of government to learn from its own mistakes and successes and feed that back into future decision making. And the second is whether there is some whether there are some interesting lessons in the national devolution journey of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland that we could think about in discussing what kinds of policies should be the priorities for more devolution in England, and what can we learn from those experiences about the right scale and scope of decision making for devolution within England. So I'm going to stop there and hand back to you, John. Thank you.
Diane, thank you very much. And you've added another series of very sharp questions to the ones that Patrick had already put in front of us for us to come back to in discussion. So thank you. I'll move straight on now to Janice.
Right, thanks very much. And just to continue this really interesting debate as it's developing, could I just have my first slide up with my key points on? The next one, thanks. What I wanted to do is just sort of look back to think about why all this is happening, because I think, you know, one can see, if you look back long enough, a kind of periodization of the different mechanisms and methods of central local relations and control, if you're looking at it from a local point of view. And I think, to pick up on the point that Patrick made, is that local government, nor indeed, of course, the Scottish and Welsh Parliaments and the Northern Ireland Assembly, are not part of the Constitution. They're creatures of statute, of Parliament, and can be abolished at any time. And I think that if we look, but ironically, if we look at the OECD research, more decentralisation of government is actually leading to greater contribution to GDP. So our centralisation is actually counting against our economic growth, according to OECD research. So this issue that the Brown Commission came up with about thinking about subnational government as part of the Constitution is clearly very important in a number of ways, beyond just the democratic elements of it, which of course are fundamental. And if you think about Tony Travers, he's often said that the way in which the centre treats local government is just a substitute for colonialism, and he kind of argues that the rise of control matched the decrease in the role of the UK government in relation to its colonies. I think that's debatable, but it's an interesting point. But I think perhaps looking at another reason why we get this kind of relationship between the centre and the local is that permanent secretaries remain responsible to Parliament for the spending in their departments. Now, this means that, say, for Department of Levelling Up, the Permanent Secretary is responsible for all the spending of local government to Parliament, even though the decisions made by local authorities will be undertaken in a democratic way. And it seems to me this is one point that we rarely discuss. But if we look back, this is, I think, a key stumbling block to actually producing any better relationships between the centre and subnational government. And lastly, I think on these key points is that when we look back to 1992 and the introduction of subsidiarity into the European treaties, then obviously this was a stepping stone for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but it seemed to have the opposite effect as far as the Cabinet Office was concerned in relation to England. And I think in a way we can see the increasing intervention of the centre from that period onwards. And when we look forward to the second point at which that was, if you like, developed in the 2009 Lisbon Treaty, we actually then saw the whole introduction of more controls over expenditure. So the centre doesn't seem to be able to cope with devolution in England, and that's because, in a way, they regard England as being their main interest, and they're not so much bothered about devolution in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, although of course, we are beginning to see those powers being chipped away and returned to the centre. So I can have the next slide, please. So we can just see this kind of periodization. If I have the next slide. Oh, sorry, yes, sorry. So we can see that obviously since the IMF issue in 1976, where that really marked the end of the post-war role of local authorities in recreating the state through a loss of capital expenditure, roads, schools, housing, and so on. And we've seen subsequently the removal of key roles from local authorities in terms of their housing role, but also thinking about education and thinking about transport. And much of this now is either controlled centrally or controlled through other agencies controlled by the centre. And then we think post-97, obviously we had best value and new public management, which is really a preparation for outsourcing to meet WTO commitments to create a market in the public sector. But we've never really discussed this. So quite a lot of public policy is changed to meet external commitments that the government has, but we never really have this public debate. And if we think about other member states, the United States, or we think about other members of the European Union, then these debates are much more in the public domain than they ever have been in the UK. So I do think there's another issue about the centre keeping these issues kind of under wraps and not debating them very transparently. And obviously we had the GOs and the RDAs as an effort to be a quasi devolved approach. And the LEPs took over that role, although initially it was said they weren't going to do that. But of course now, if you look at Wikipedia, there's the government statement on Wikipedia that makes that as a kind of post hoc rationalisation for their introduction and implementation rules. And then lastly, of course, we've had deals, and we've seen these since 2012, and what the announcement yesterday was, if you like, the latest wave of these deals. And when we look at them now, we actually have deals covering virtually the whole of the territory of the United Kingdom. And this means that there are people in Whitehall signing off projects of about £60,000, which is so ridiculous as to really re-emphasize the points that both Patrick and Diana have already made. And we need to really think about, is this the best use of government time? As both Patrick and Diana have said, how can the centre really know what's needed locally? And it was interesting yesterday to read that rather impassioned speech, I think tweet was it, or blog from Andy Street, who's obviously just had enough of this kind of begging bowl and bidding culture, which I think everybody else has seen, but he's now had enough himself. Can I have the next slide, please? But this still goes on. So if we look at the Levelling Up white paper, although we're not talking about the United Kingdom today, it does actually refer to the whole of the United Kingdom. And it's very interesting if you listen to the language of the Prime Minister and you listen to Michael Gove, they always talk about the United Kingdom now, not about England. And so the idea in this white paper is to have the same control frameworks for local authorities across the UK. Now, I'm not sure how that's going to work in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but we will see. In England, we have the Office for Local Government being set up, of which we know little or nothing at the moment. So there's a new acronym, OFLOG, that we'll have to get to understand. And really, this is going to measure how local authorities are implementing these missions which are set out in the white paper. but again, which we know very little about in practice, although I'm sure people are trying to understand more. But I think just to finish on this kind of rather bleak narrative, I think what we also see, particularly from local government, is that local authorities have always responded to those issues that are around them, local need, and whether that's been to provide telephones, to provide energy, to provide restaurants, to provide support in poverty and public health, they've always stepped into a gap. They found a gap when government has been directing them elsewhere. And I think now we can see that local authorities are providing a huge amount of affordable housing, which is largely going unnoticed nationally. They're providing it directly, using their own funds to do that, even though they don't have much money. They're providing energy through energy networks, but also through organising all the warm places that we're having this winter. And the leadership of place post-pandemic is rather significant, and again, not really being picked up, the way in which local authorities are working with other partners from the private and the third sector to actually try to reinvigorate place. And the funding that came yesterday is really just a bit of icing on many of those cakes, where local authorities are actually really working hard to do something to revitalise their places. So local authorities still manage to survive despite all this control and continuing poor relationship, if you like, with the centre. Thank you.
Janice, thank you very much, and not least for ending up on an upbeat note there to after the list of problems that we are going to have to try to solve. I'll go now to Arianna to give us another perspective.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks very much, colleagues, for the very very good contribution that linked very much to what I am going to say, really. So John asked me to think about looking at center-local relations, how localities experience negotiating with the center, considering all the issues that have been raised so far. And I think that I'm going to cover like 3 examples that show the current limits. The first one looks at the way in which devolution deals have been carried out since 2015. The second one relates to mayors, and the third one tries to link this debate to a kind of an international perspective. I think the point that Patrick made at the beginning about the question and problem of institutional churn is a very important one. Just to give a bit of context, because it means that new institutions will constantly appear and disappear at subnational level. And this creates a web of networks that actually lack effective, what we called in a recent paper that I wrote with a colleague for IPPR North, it lacks effective vectors and connectors. So the center tries to do too much. It tries to cover a lot at the local level from a kind of using a top-down approach, but having to operate within a web of institutions that paradoxically it has created itself, it actually struggles to manage this complex web of relations in an effective way, because there are no good connections. And so this certainly limits the interaction between the center and localities and affects negotiations, especially when we look at the way in which devolution has developed so far. So the 3 examples that I just mentioned, let's start with the first one. If we look at the way in which devolution deals have been kind of agreed between local government groups of council in the form of combined authorities and the center, we see that the approach is extremely ad hoc. And this means that different localities manage to get different things depending on the way in which the center approaches them and they approach the center. But the system is so disconnected that it creates a kind of a very complex and disconnected scenario. So the 3 key examples that we can use to understand these complexities are, for example, Greater Manchester, when they got the devolution deal back in 2015. That was a very specific local context. You had 10 councils that have been working together for a very long period of time. The government had an interest in collaborating and negotiating with them because they wanted Greater Manchester to be kind of the good example of how you do devolution when they were launching the devolution deals back then. And so that became a kind of the model of how devolution should work and how negotiations should work. But back to the point that was made previously, it will also, the success of that process of negotiation was also very much related to personal and political connections. So the center was willing to collaborate with the local level in that case, and there were good connections. But then on the opposite kind of side, you can look at the example of what was called back then the Sheffield City Region Combined Authority, when they were negotiating with the center for to agree their devolution deal back in 2015. Actually, they were told by the center that they had to kind of approach the negotiations in a very pragmatic way. So back then there was, for example, a debate on whether there should be a Sheffield City Region devolution deal or a Yorkshire wide devolution deal. Through interviews that I did for the book that I wrote with Craig Berry on the political economy of the Northern Powerhouse, it emerged that local leaders within the Sheffield City region, for example, were told that they had to negotiate just with the center and close debates and discussions with the other local authorities at the Yorkshire-wide level if they wanted to get any sort of devolution deal. So there was, again, a very different approach there to negotiations that, yes, led to a devolution deal in the end for the Sheffield City region Combined Authority, but one that was very problematic because, well, we know what happened and how long it took actually to get it over the line, and also something that actually that had a lot of strings attached. If they wanted a devolution deal, they had to cut off the links with the rest of the region. And then there was the West Yorkshire or the Leeds City region back then devolution deal that never happened because in 2015, because they took a completely different approach from Greater Manchester and Sheffield. Actually, they didn't accept the conditions imposed by the centre, but they say, well, this is the devolution deal that we want, and it's a very, very ambitious one. There were a lot of asks in their initial proposal, and the centre said no. They probably saw that the local level was trying to exert too much agency in that case. So these are just three examples that show that, sorry, just to conclude on the West Yorkshire bit, of course, in the end, it did happen, but only, what was it, a couple of years ago. But I was talking about the example of what was the situation in 2015. So these three examples really show like how the kind of the way the experience of negotiating with the center can vary hugely across different localities. And the result of this is a multi-speed, uncoordinated process of devolution that actually creates a lot of competition, creates new inequalities, and at the end doesn't really address the existing ones. So the process is ad hoc and not asymmetric, because it seems to respond or try to follow more the needs of the center than, and also the political kind of needs of the center than those of the localities that should benefit from devolution. And this type of approach to negotiation is often place blind because it's more focused on political kind of issues rather than policy and place-based one. The second example that kind of shows how we have a multi-speed and uncoordinated process of negotiations is the one of metro mayors. I'm not going to cover all the metro mayors, but let's take, this is something that I covered in an article for the Political Quarterly that I published last year. If you look at the different styles of leadership that different metro mayors have developed over time, they reflect the problem with negotiating with the center. So metro mayors, in theory, should have provided new forms of political leadership that could have improved the connection with the center. But in practice, this is not necessarily happening. Metro mayors can make use of vertical and horizontal relations in the way in which they use their leadership and in the way in which they engage with central government. But different metro mayors have used this type of relations in different ways. And if you look at the two extreme examples, Andy Burnham and Ben Houchen, we see that, for example, Andy Burnham, despite the fact that he is leading the Greater Manchester Combined Authority that had very good links with the centre at the beginning, as the role of the mayor has become more politicized, he has actually adopted a more kind of adversarial sort of relationship and approach to the centre. And we've seen that during the COVID pandemic and the various kind of rows that he had with the Prime Minister back then. And in that sphere of vertical and horizontal relations, Andy Burnham has focused more on the horizontal ones. So he's kind of tried to harness more relationship at the local level while keeping a kind of a more problematic, perhaps, link with the center. In recent times, he has opened up more. For example, we've seen this in the various the most recent rounds of funding, with Manchester has been benefited from them. But it was clear that there was also like a political dimension to it. So being a strong Labour Metro Mayor meant that the relationship with the centre were more problematic for a while. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you got Ben Houchen, who of course leads a combined authority that was very important for the levelling up agenda. And so the negotiations with the centre were much easier for him. It was much easier for him to get access to certain type of resources as compared to some other of his colleagues and other mayors that came from have a different political persuasion, and also are operating in areas that were not so central, perhaps, to the levelling up agenda. And so again, this type of approach creates binaries and does not really address the key issue of creating better connections between the centre and localities. You have types of negotiations between the centre and metro mayors that are, again, very much disconnected and do not address the key issue. A final point: if we take all of this and we try to put it in a comparative perspective, this shows that to be effective, negotiations between the centre and localities in a truly devolved system really need to be based on a relationship of equals. This is something that Janice was touching upon earlier on, and this is not the case, of course, within the Westminster model and the British political system. So that there is a need to create like a relationship of equals, or at least a recognition of the importance of the local and regional level, and some degree of trust on behalf of the centre towards the local and subnational level. The fact that there isn't a written constitution, of course, is a big issue here, and is what allows the centre to take that kind of top-down approach. And this is clearly reflected in the type of negotiations that we see between the centre and the local level. I had a couple of points on how this all links to the Westminster model, but I think I'm running out of time, John, am I not? So I might bring them back in the discussion. I can't hear you, John, sorry.
Imagine I've just asked you a question about how this links to the Westminster model, so you can segue into our Q&A section.
Okay, so I guess this all brings back to the way in which reform of the subnational level works within the Westminster model, because previous and current approach to reform have been kind of a sort of an exercise of what Professor James Mitchell called constitutional plumbing. So attempts at trying to graft reform onto the existing Westminster model, but without actually trying to fix the structure in the first place. So you got a lot of sticking plasters on a very kind of old plumbing structure, and the more you keep putting plaster, the more that becomes unstable. And yes, it continues to work, but is not particularly efficient. And so if we look at the kind of effect of this in the long term, of this kind of short-term fixes and sticking plaster, that means the system has become more unstable, not least, and even more so in the context of the current kind of interaction of crisis from Brexit to COVID and the current cost of living crisis. And the idea that the Westminster model creates a strong centre, I think this links to what Patrick was saying earlier on, but Patrick, correct me if I'm wrong, is also showing that the centre is trying to do too much, is trying to exert too much power, and it's trying to show that it is trying to show its strength. But actually, this continuous attempt at trying to dominate from the top down, the subnational level, is actually kind of betrays some form of weakness on the part of the centre, or the centre's inability to act as a kind of a strategic steward of place and coordinate the kind of complex challenging and delivering of of a kind of clear policy strategy for complex policy agendas such as devolution and leveling up in a sustainable way. So in other words, in my view, this approach foregrounds failings of a kind of a paternalistic approach whereby central government treats local government bodies as if they were children, while wrongly assuming that Whitehall officials know the needs of individual local areas better than local leaders. And so this means, if we look at how to address this issue, I think this means that there is a need to redesign central-local relations in a way that is based on a new kind of hierarchy that frees up the center from kind of that approach to operational control and reorientate it towards communication and collaboration around concrete challenges. So in other words, a center that engages in close and more consistent relationship, communications and shared responsibility with all the levels of subnational governance. A center that does not sit above localities, but works collaboratively with them in short. So that's
great. Thank you very much, and thanks to all our panelists. That's been absolute tour de force between you. I mean, not a comprehensive list, but just things I've jotted down. We have problems of our political culture and our party politics culture. We have issues about the constitutional structures of local government of the centre. We've got issues of capacity and competence at the centre, the culture of Whitehall, its structure and its accountability. And then we have all of the consequences of those things for which we've just ended up on the way that requires people to behave at local level. I'm just going to throw in one question and to the panel, if you want to pass on it, do pass on it. But if you'd like to comment, do, and just wave your hand and I'll take you first. Can we just start by trying to separate out artificially in our minds the extent to which we have a problem of the culture of party politics and the way party politics works, and the culture and structure of Whitehall itself? If we as a thought experiment imagined a benign 2-year period of time ahead where central government politicians said, look, we want to devolve power across England, but we're going to leave it to you, the civil service, to design structures that work. How much devolution would we actually get? Or is the problem really that politicians and Whitehall civil servants reinforce each other in their desire essentially to keep control and micromanage from the centre? Does anybody want to have a shot at that? No, nobody wants to. Janice. You're muted, Janice.
Sorry, it's a bit more fundamental than this, I think. And I think it goes back to thinking about the Constitution. And I think no matter what you do in the short term, which for thinking about a period of political administration, 5 years or whatever, it can always be undone by the next administration. And whilst all of our subnational institutions, democratic institutions, are creatures of Parliament, then there is always a sense that in Whitehall they can always be changed. I mean, I suspect people in Whitehall didn't think necessarily the devolved administrations would develop as they did, and this might be another, short-termist kind of approach. So I do think that we really got to bite the bullet and think about something much more fundamental to make this work. And I think anything else is going to be short-term and isn't necessarily going to be the kind of reform that we all acknowledge is required, I think, to really change this relationship.
Yeah. Diane, thank you. Diane, you talked about the incoherence under the Johnson administration, but the obvious question that came into my mind was even if you had some particular ministers at that time, why was it Whitehall couldn't produce a series of documents that at least cross-referenced each other coherently? That wouldn't appear to be something that would have undermined the Boris Johnson administration.
Well, I was going to respond to your question by saying you couldn't just fix one of them, either Westminster politics or Whitehall, because even if you imagined a benign, competent Whitehall that was able to do that joining up, which evidently does not happen across departmental lines. I think for reasons of ministerial accountability, perhaps. But even if you had that, you wouldn't solve the information problem. And you cannot fix everything around the whole of the country without that input of local information and the power to respond to it.
Okay. Can I follow that one up then with one of the questions that's come in, which is, I think, possibly a reference to the Brown report for the Labour Party, but other discussions, which there should be some sort of body that represents England's subnational government at the centre, the language of nations and regions, and the idea that Labour can somehow be, that England can be represented through its regions is needed. Do people feel that that's a good way forward? Arianna?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And I think that, again, if we look at this issue in comparative perspective, we see that it is a fundamental problem that characterizes how central local relations work in the UK and in particular in England. If you look at countries where there is, well, of course, if there is a fully fledged federal system, there is a system of official forums that almost like create or force that connection between the central and subnational levels. But even in more kind of hybrid or regionalized systems like Spain or Italy, for example, having a representation for localities and regions at the center is essential to improve those relationships. This is something, for example, that the APSI Local Government Commission report that was published last year recommended the creation of some kind of official forums. And of course, there is an open debate as to how you do it and whether it should be regional representation or local level representation, but having some kind of official forums where there can be a productive dialogue between subnational governance institutions and central government is essential to improve things. In countries like Italy, for example, you got like permanent committees that actually represent local government. There is one that represents local government, there is one that represents mayors, and there is one that represents regions. They are not, they're all in place, and the fact that they're all in place means that there has to be some form of communication. And even though the center ultimately maintain the ability to make decisions if they want to, having a written constitutions and these official forums means that the center cannot impose things on the local level in the way in which it does in the UK. So in my view, yes, that would be a good thing to do and to achieve going forward. Of course, there is a problem of institutional design. How do you do it and what levels you represent? That's an open discussion on that.
Just to pick up that point and to join it to Janice's earlier comment, can that work without local government having some sort of constitutional reality rather than simply being the centre deciding to consult in a particular way?
Of course, that's another fundamental question. There must be some kind of official recognition of the role that local government and other subnational governance institutions play, I think, because otherwise the centre still has, it's still too much kind of at the whims of the government of the day to decide whether they want to have a positive relationship and engage with these forums or not. Whether if these forums are kind of entrenched in a written constitution, they have to. They don't have a choice.
Yeah. I do remember in the early years of the Labour government going to the meetings of the nominated regional assemblies that were sort of an early attempt to establish some sort of forum for local government. I have to say, I'm not sure they had a great deal of purchase on any of the policies that the central government carried out. Could I go to Patrick to pick up one point and one question? There's a question in from Jeff Glover, I think, about electoral reform. Patrick, you were talking both about two things, I think. One was the lack of bipartisanship in the approach to central local relations. And the second was the fact that there has to be a dialogue between central and local in a way that doesn't exist at the moment. I mean, is electoral reform a key or one of the keys to changing both the way the centre operates and understanding that a government has to work with Andy Burnham and Andy Street, and there always will be people of different parties? So is that the key to changing political culture, or does it come from somewhere else?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think inevitably it's a combination of trying to shift the culture as well as trying to alter the hardwiring of how the state functions. And I think you have to try to do both of those. In a sense, I mean, electoral reform is an institutional reform, but its promise is arguably greatest in terms of its capacity to change the political culture, in terms of trying to engender a more pluralist approach, the idea of political parties talking to one another, having to have dialogue, having to negotiate over electoral programs and manifestos. I think all of these attributes, which of course would depend on the type of electoral reform that you did. I mean, as you know very well, John, it would depend a lot on the type of electoral system that you ended up adopting, but that point notwithstanding, can you shift the culture? But my point is that that's necessary but not sufficient, because it comes down to the hardwiring of how the state operates, and a lot of this reflects issues of what academics call path dependency, you know, hardwiring that has accrued over many decades, habits of thought, ways of acting, selection of appropriate governance tools, which often reflect, as I say, you know, long-standing notions of how the state should operate, particularly in terms of how civil servants and ministers think about how to implement policies. So I think you'd have to address both of those. And I think back to your earlier question, you could have a more benign administration. You could have ministers that think much more imaginatively about English devolution. But if they're operating in a system that still has this hardwiring in it, then I think it's unlikely that success will be long-lived. So I think we do have to address the fundamental questions. One thing I just add very quickly, John, is that on the fundamental issues, I think it also does come down to relationships between ministers and civil servants. I mean, Janice touched on this very important point about permanent secretaries and accountability for public spending. But I think it also reflects how ministers and civil servants work together, the reciprocal bargain that underpins their relationship, and the way in which that reciprocal bargain in itself, I think, contributes towards an impetus or a tendency towards centralisation. I think there are other things I could say about that, but I think it's another reflection of this fundamental hardwiring in terms of how the state operates.
Yeah, thank you. I think that leads us to a question that Kevin Lloyd's put in. Essentially, can you change the way in which the accountability that Janice mentioned actually works, so there's lesser focus, I think he's suggesting, on holding to people account after the event, and a different way of overseeing whether public funds have been used effectively, which takes some of the pressure off the current drive that makes permanent secretaries directly accountable for every penny that's spent, whether that's spent locally or nationally. Is it conceivable we could bring in a different system of accountability for public funds? Janice or Diane, do you have thoughts on that? Diane.
I'll kick us off, not by answering your question directly, John, but by saying that the accountability that we have is a bit of a farce at the moment. I mean, the Treasury has departmental negotiations, sets budgets, these are cascaded down and to local government as well. But without evaluation, we don't know whether we're getting value for money or not. At the moment, I'm working on a project with Dave Richards and Sam Warner at Manchester and Martin Smith at Sheffield, looking at public spending control from the bottom up. And that accountability just isn't followed through. So if you're looking at a spending line such as special educational needs in schools or prisons, which we are doing, it's not possible to account for the money anyway. So the idea that the kind of accountability structures we have are working well is a myth.
Thank you. Can I follow that up? If you looked at this closely, to what extent is what we're really talking about the problem that there is no national government of England in the sense of a governmental structure that focuses on England, which has the effect that the Treasury micromanages departments quite separately from each other? And unless comprehensive spending reviews have changed, there's very little cross-departmental discussion in a comprehensive spending review. It's a bilateral negotiation with the Treasury. So is some of this just a cipher for the overbearing micromanagement of the Treasury within the system of government?
I think that's part of it, but I'm also arguing that the micromanagement it's micro, but it's not managing.
Okay.
It's just not effective.
No, so the Treasury has an illusion that it is controlling public money by the way it operates, but it isn't.
But it isn't. So without being able to monitor across private and public prisons or different types of schools, what the budget lines are and evaluating whether they're effective in delivering good special educational needs or the outcomes you want from criminal justice, it's not delivering, it's not doing anything.
Thank you. Janice, did you want to follow up on that?
Yes, I think there's another issue. For example, in France, they actually have a subsidiarity commission where they determine which function of the state is best conducted by which level of the state. And when we think about how new legislation or new services are implemented in England, then it's rather haphazard, in my experience, as to where they get located. Nobody really thinks of that, and there's no real discussion about that. So I think that's one thing that might be helpful. The second thing is that, for example, in Scotland, then Scotland has a single civil service, and they've abolished the departmental ties, if you like, within Scotland. And it's said that that operates more effectively. So I just wonder, if these things, they need a much more fundamental look. And as Diana said, this kind of issue about the micromanaging of budgets. I mean, we've known for some time, probably since at least the early 90s, that hasn't worked. But nothing is going to change it, because I think it's something that permanent secretaries are going to hang on to, for forever. Just because that is, in a sense, their whole raison d'etre for everything that they do. And I think that is an issue that never gets questioned, really.
Okay, thank you. Could I follow up with a question to Arianna about local capacity? So we've had, the capacity of the centre to do this doesn't come out very well from what we've heard in the last hour. But there has clearly been a massive stripping out of capacity in local government over the past 10 years in particular. And is there a problem now in doing devolution successfully at a time when the capacity of local government to take on additional responsibilities, whether in the area set out in the Levelling Up white paper or the Brown report or others, is quite demanding? And if so, how in practice do you overcome that problem? And will the centre tend to use the very fact that it's weakened localities as a reason not to do devolution?
I think that's the point, isn't it? That this is exactly what happened. The centre keeps saying, well, the local level doesn't have enough capacity to do devolution well, so we impose it from the top down in the way we want it to do, and we do it in a piecemeal way. But there has been certainly a reduced capacity at the local level, but we need to understand, who's responsible for that, because it is like the kind of austerity, of course, has played a huge role in this process of reducing the capacity of the local level. But this is something that was initiated by the centre itself. So I guess it goes back to the issue of having a centre that is not effective in kind of putting forwards initiatives that actually end up weakening the other structures of governance that operate around it. So there is an issue of capacity at the local level. But it's also true that despite all the challenges of the past decade, the local level has also demonstrated a huge level of resilience as well. So I'm not saying that all places would be able, not all places, to put it simply, not all places are Greater Manchester. Not all places can take a huge package of devolution and make it work straight away, because they don't have the same history of institutional cooperation across councils and things like that. There are places that would struggle more to kind of put into practice and develop a good process of a good devolution deal. But this doesn't mean that these places too shouldn't be given the opportunity to do it. So in a piece of work that we did when I was at IPPR North a while back with Marcus Jones, we actually argued that the way forward, the way to balance this kind of question about whether, well, we want devolution, but the local level might not be able to deliver properly on that is to embrace the principle of subsidiarity, going back to what Janice was saying earlier on, and making sure that the center is prepared to let go of power, but also trust the local level and allows different areas to take on devolution deals at their own pace, in the way that works for them. So without imposing a model or a structure for a specific devolution deal on areas, but actually having local areas to say, well, we may start from A, maybe a small devolution deal that help us to build institutional capacity and collaboration across councils, and then in a number of years we will get to a more ambitious one. So some areas might want to operate in that way, other areas might be able and capable to take on a more ambitious deal straight away and work that way. So that would be a really asymmetric kind of approach to do devolution deals in England, as opposed to the ad hoc one that we have now, where it is the centre that decides who can get devolution deals and on what terms and conditions.
Thank you. The Brown report seems to suggest that rather than just relocating government departments to Darlington or whatever, that Whitehall civil servants should be moved out progressively, but in quite large numbers, to strengthen local capacity. I just wondered, is that actually a realistic strategy, or is it better to allow local levels to recruit? I mean, I can see with a small P politically how it makes it easier to handle, but whether the onus shouldn't be on local areas and regions to recruit the people that they want with the skill sets that they need.
I don't think it's a capacity problem so much as a resources problem. And if local authorities have the resources, they can hire good people. And there are lots of excellent officers in local authorities around England. I would actually like to see more central civil servants spend part of their career outside of Whitehall. But one could do that through promotion criteria. You know, you're much more likely to make it to PermSec if you've had 7 or 10 years, not sitting in a central department.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you. John Townsend's put an interesting one, which is that one of the things you could share about the Shared Prosperity Fund is that it hasn't had to follow European Union rules. And he asked whether there are Brexit benefits that could help us do things differently if the state is free from EU rules to do devolution better. That's quite an interesting one, which I haven't heard posed recently, but I think it's an interesting one. So Diane, you're shaking your head, so I'm going to bring you in first.
No, there was always much more flexibility under state aid than was pretended. State aid was just an excuse for not spending.
Absolutely.
So the rules themselves were not the constraint on the kind of investment in particular skills or industries.
Right. Okay. Any other thoughts, Janice?
Well, yeah. I was going to say, actually, I thought that this ad hoc package that we had yesterday was a mopping up of the end of the EU money, and that these are projects to be done, you know, by using that money that we still have until the end of 2025. So I rather took the different view. And I think, you know, to come back to the crux of the question, actually, subnational government had a huge amount of protection under the EU treaties, where it was enshrined and it had to be done. And you know, we would have had much more devolution in England had we stayed in the EU than coming out. So actually, it's had the reverse effect. It's actually weakened devolution and promoted the opportunities for the centre to take more control of this micro control than actually if we'd stayed in the EU. So I think I'd rather think the other way around.
Just to add to what Janice has said, if that's okay, John, I think you won't be surprised to know that there's a degree of scepticism on the panel about whether Brexit has led to such benefits. I do think that when one looks across the board, the general pattern since Brexit, since the process began in 2016, you know, has been one of further centralisation in many different areas of public policy. And I think, you know, the difficulty here is that Britain's departure from the European Union has meant that the fundamental principle of EU governance around subsidiarity has been weakened in all sorts of areas. And, you know, I think that has lots of important implications that we'll have to address, because, as I say, since Brexit, I think the surreptitious recentralisation, both in England but also from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, is a really serious governance problem that we will have to grapple with in the future.
Yeah,
can I just add a
Arianna,
quick point
please,
on this? Because I think it's an interesting point. I agree with what has been said so far. And in principle, let's say that in theory, if we look at the take back control slogan, that could have been promising. But the problem is that, yeah, we've taken back control, but we've given more, there is now more control at the center, and no, it has not been kind of passed down to localities, and that is the limit. So there was an opportunity, but it has not been, if there was an opportunity, it has not been taken on board.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to start drawing us towards a close now. So I'm going to go around the panel and ask people to make any final reflections. I think one of the things that's really striking here is a lot of overlap and commonality of analysis, but also the challenge of making a whole series of changes in a reasonably coordinated and effective way, but also a very strong message that governments are simply not going to be able to deliver the objectives they have for public policy if they continue to govern in this way, and nor are governments going to be able to make the best use of public money. So I'm going to go through each of the panelists and ask them to say a few words. I'll go in reverse order, if I may. But I also, and I did give some notice of this about an hour ago, I'd like each person on the panel just to say, having said you can't just change one thing and make it all work, but nonetheless, if there was one thing you wanted to change in the way in which the centre operates, what would it be? So closing thoughts from each of you and your one area of change. Arianna. I
think I'll say really embrace the principle of subsidiarity in a way that is not politically driven and just something that you write on political manifestos, but in a way that really kind of opens up to localities, trusts local government, and gives different areas the possibility to have a devolution deal at their own pace, so that this becomes a policy that can benefit all people and places and not just a few selected ones.
Thank you. Janice.
I would endorse that, of course, but I think something we haven't mentioned today, but I think maybe reform of the House of Lords to become a second chamber of nations and places in some way. And if we can't get reform of the Constitution, this would be the next best thing, I think, to achieve the change. Thank you. Diane.
I'm very troubled by the lack of long-termism at a time when we're going through major technological transformations, net zero transformation, and the decisions that get taken now will affect people's living standards in this country for a very long time to come. So I would like to see devolution by function, I guess, and perhaps education to start with. And we've fragmented our education system with different types of schooling. Let's try it a different way and devolve at least post-16 education.
Thank you. Thank you. Patrick.
Just one final reflection, and then I'll try to answer your question, John. Just my final reflection about your question on local capacity is that it is undoubtedly the case that in the last decade, local capacity has been significantly weakened. But as others have said, there is a lot of very talented people working in local authorities and combined authorities across England. And I think I would also add, what is very striking about really effective local authorities in England and also combined authorities is that they have a very intelligent approach to how to use power, which I think the centre of government could really learn from. If you look at, and I think Janice was reflecting on this in terms of the response to COVID, but the way in which local authorities seem to be able to work intelligently with a wide variety of partners, whether it's elsewhere in the public sector, whether it's the private sector, whether it's civil society or the voluntary and community sector, I think that's something that the centre and Whitehall could actually really learn from in terms of a much more mutual policy learning process. Finally, to your point about reforms, my proposal, which is perhaps a little niche, but I think is really important, is to think about having a joint profession, particularly a joint policy profession that would unite central government and local government so that there's much more transfusion in roles between people working at the centre and working at the local level. And I think that also includes building up analytical capacity. I think what Diane was saying earlier about evaluation is really important, both at the centre and the local level. We still lack, I think, the means to properly evaluate and learn from policy initiatives. So if we could strengthen that within the wider frame of creating more of a harmonised policy profession across both local government, devolved areas and central government nationally, I think that would go some way, at least, to dealing with some of the capacity issues that have been flagged up during this discussion.
Thank you. There's some really good and very practical ideas there. I think it's been a fantastic webinar. Thank you to all of the panel. All of the contributions will be worth rereading and rewatching. We'll post the video in a week or so's time. The next webinar for the centre is